Welcome everybody to our in-house in focus session on ESG. So I'm your chair today. I'm James. I'm joined by Neil and Carla, who are just going to introduce themselves in a moment. So in the usual way, please do interact with us through the Q&A. If you put your name on it, we will be able to come back to you if we don't get to all of the questions. If you use anonymous, it's very hard for us to come back to you afterwards, and I can't give you a shout out when I read your question. That's what we're going to be talking about, current ESG issues that in-house counsel should be thinking about. So it's a bit on seal. And just some housekeeping. So we'll go about half an hour plus some questions. There will be a recording available afterwards. As I said, please use the Q&A box. And when you leave, please do stay to the end, but when you leave, there will be a pop-up which will ask you to complete to give us some feedback. If you're just going to roast us for talking about Rick Astley, please don't. But if you can send us some love for talking about Rick Astley, that would be lovely and welcomed. Right, I'm going to pause there. Some of you may be pleased to hear. I'm going to ask Carla and Neil to introduce themselves, and then we'll get going.
Okay, yeah. Morning, everyone. My name's Neil Pearson, partner at Mills and Reeve, based in Grey but Dry, Birmingham. And my role is head of ESG and social value within the business, which effectively puts me in the shoes of many of you, I suspect, in that my job is to drive forward our firm's ESG strategy and then make sure it's implemented as best we can. My role is also to make sure, as far as I can, that our lawyers are aware of ESG and how it impacts on all of our clients. That's my job.
And I'm Carla Parsons, and I'm an associate in the commercial team at Mills and Reeve. So while I specialise in commercial law, I also do a lot of work on ESG. So whether that's advising clients on ESG requirements, whether that's looking at social value requirements in terms of procurements, or it might be just writing, doing webinars, anything to promote ESG and discuss it and to help our clients navigate through what can sometimes be a complex journey. And I regularly work with Neil as well and look at and sit on various ESG committees within Mills and Reeve as well. And I think we've got a poll as well to run on ESG.
Sure, here we go.
So we'd be really grateful if you could take a quick look at the poll and give us your honest opinions. It's basically, how would you rate your organisation progress on its ESG journey? Some of you may have attended when we did the session just over a year ago when we ran the same poll. So it'll be interesting to look at how the results compare as well to back then. So I'll give it a minute more just for people to put their answers in.
62% people participated.
This 18 months ago, I think, where we had a lot more in the we're starting to discuss it and the what's ESG bracket. And great to see that there are 2 attendants who are all over it.
So Neil and I are delighted to be able to talk to you about ESG today. As we both said, we did a similar presentation about 18 months ago, and some of you may have attended. And some of the topics that we are going to talk about, if you did attend 18 months ago, will be very similar. However, in the 18 months since we originally did this session, the world has pretty much fundamentally changed. We have had the invasion of Ukraine. We have had several different prime ministers. We have seen the UK and the world enter into an energy crisis. The cost of living has gone up. There have been so many different issues that we've been trying to tackle with as businesses, organizations, and on a personal level. And you might think ESG could potentially become less important while we're trying to tackle all those issues, but in fact, it's actually become increasingly important for businesses and organizations to tackle. And you as in-house counsel will often be at the forefront of considering how your organization looks at ESG. And it's really great to see that many of you are already on that journey at some point. But whichever point you're on, it's never a bad idea to strip it back to the basics, think about what it is and why we're doing it. So Neil and I are going to talk through a couple of different topics. First, Neil will take you through the basics of ESG. I'll look at some of the drivers for change, so Neil will do the what and I'll do the why. And then Neil will look at some of the governance risks around ESG and funding and the impact of ESG ratings. And finally, we'll look at some of the ESG trends that may have come across your radar, or if they haven't, they will come across your radar imminently. So I'm now going to hand over to Neil to discuss the basics of ESG for a good reminder of what this is about.
Okay, thanks, Carla. I for many years, my day job has been as a tax lawyer, and I'm a big fan always when trying to explain a big issue or complex issue of starting with the absolute basics. So apologies for those 3 people who said they were all over it, but let's start with what is ESG, just as a basic reminder of what we're talking about. Well, as a tax lawyer, I'd love 3-letter acronyms. There's lots of it in my world. ESG is a really handy shorthand, I think, these days for the way in which any organisation becomes a more responsible citizen, or as we put it at Mills and Reeve, doing the right thing in the right way, if we possibly can, and is the classic drive away from what used to be called shareholder capitalism, i.e. the sole responsibility of business was to make profits for the shareholders, and towards a stakeholder capitalism in which businesses recognise that every stakeholder, people, planet, communities, customers, suppliers, all have a stake in the way in which businesses run themselves. One of the difficulties we face in the world of ESG is it means different things to different people, and we have long sought for the holy grail of a standardised approach to ESG and what it means to everybody. We're not there yet, but as we'll see later on with regulation, we're trying to get closer. But the basic premise of all of this, and certainly the way in which I describe it when I'm talking to our board and people internally, is that no organisation can be sustainable in the long term if its activities come at too great a cost to society. So this isn't just a nice to have. This isn't just about environmental sustainability or social sustainability. This is about the sustainability of your business in a financial sense in the long term. Next slide, please. So a quick canter through the obvious aspects of what ESG are. E, the environmental preservation of the natural world. It's pretty obvious most of us, if not all of us on this session, will have, I hope, a net zero strategy, or at least be formulating one. We've had ours in place for a year or so. It's fair to say our clients expect us to. We've worked hard on it, and I suspect we will drive to make it more ambitious than it currently is. But basically, we have to reduce CO2 emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. We look at water usage and management, waste management, not so much of a big issue for professional services firms, but for lots of manufacturing industry, a big issue. The impacts of deforestation, we as a business act for a lot of people in the food and agricultural sector, for whom that's a huge issue. And obviously pollution for a lot of manufacturing companies and energy companies. Next slide. On the S, it's all about people and communities. So it's all about your people, and it's all about the people who live in the communities that you serve, where you are based. So under S, we're looking at issues, more obvious issues like employee diversity and inclusion and social mobility. Human rights plays a big part in a lot of issues for businesses, both in their supply chain and who they act for, in our case. Fair employment practices and pay, wide issues around that for HR and people teams. Harassment and bullying, data security and privacy, and so on. And also within S, which I think people kind of forget, is what used to be called CSR, contribution to local communities. CSR is becoming, I think, a bit of an outdated phrase or expression now. People often ask me, what's the difference between CSR and ESG? Well, CSR is a kind of a nice to have add-on to what you do on a daily basis. It's all about contributing back to communities, which is fantastic. But for many years, CSR has been something that people would simply add on to what they currently did. So they would operations as normal, business as normal, and then do a bit of CSR. ESG is a fundamental shift in the way in which you do business. ESG should be part of the DNA of how you behave when you are doing business. That is fundamentally different from CSR, which is fantastic, but should be just a part of your ESG strategy. Next slide, please.
I have to say, I really like that analysis, Neil, and that analogy, and the difference between CSR and ESG. Really well put.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's fundamental. It's part of our DNA. Governance. Yes, this is the bit I always find that gets overlooked in ESG. Lots of people really, it's pretty simple to understand the E bit. Emit less carbon, use less resource, create less waste. Social side, most people are pretty au fait with the issues that businesses face. But the governance side of it gets a bit overlooked. But for me, in many ways, the governance is the key bit, as we'll come on to in a later slide, because this is about process. This is about how you get things done. And when I say that ESG should be part of the DNA of your business, this is where governance plays a key part to make sure it happens. So you look across from board structure, from your policies, not just ethics, but all of your policies, how you deal with anti-bribery and corruption, and whistleblowing is an absolutely key one if you want to improve the ESG credentials of any business. Next slide, please.
Before I put the next slide up, your video is giving us some interesting effects, I have to say, but oh, there we go.
As I'm not sure whether that's an improvement or not, but it's clearer.
I was quite enjoying the psychedelic effects, but yeah, it's very good.
Back to Glastonbury.
Yeah, couldn't possibly comment.
Okay, so I'll hand you over to Carla to talk about drivers for change.
Thanks, Neil. So as Neil said, for all of us, ESG should be the DNA of your business. And as I'm sure almost all of you here are aware, we constantly hear that we are in a climate emergency, and if we don't do something, we are heading for catastrophe. So those are kind of, for many of us, those are fundamental reasons why wouldn't you do ESG? But it hasn't always been what businesses have done. As Neil was saying, the business of business for a long time was about making profit, about share value. So why have we made that fundamental shift where we now all see the importance of ESG, or we're all on an ESG journey? And I thought there were three key drivers for me, which have meant that ESG has become a critical issue for businesses. And the first one is regulation, legislation, litigation. So those legal reasons. Second, financial reasons. And third, reputational issues. So we start with the regulation, legislation, litigation. So ESG, regulation, legislation is nothing new. Most of us are very keenly aware that there have been diversity and inclusion policies, equality policies required by companies for a very long time. But we have in the past few years seen an increased amount of particularly climate related legislation. And we've had an increase of ESG related legislation by 155% over the last 10 years. So 155% is a huge increase. So what are some of the reasons for this? Now, a key turning point in the history of ESG was in 2015, when the UN Conference of the Parties, or COP21, happened in Paris. And at that conference, the majority of the attendees agreed to sign up to the Paris Agreement, which required them to reduce their carbon emissions. So on the back of that, many governments have fed through legislation and regulation about how they achieve their net zero ambitions. And the UK government was one of the first to put into actual legislation the requirement to meet net zero targets by 2050. But ESG regulation legislation is still, while it's been increasing, it's still in its infancy, and it's not, as Neil said, it's not standardized. There's not one set of ESG regulations you can easily follow. And I know for a lot of organizations that does cause a bit of confusion. What should I be doing? Which framework do I follow? So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a breakdown of how this works and what you might be needing to think about. So ESG legislation is both at the moment mandatory, things like the Modern Slavery Act, and voluntary. For some of those mandatory legislation and regulations, you will follow them depending on the size of your organization. For example, various disclosures companies are required to make now under the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure Framework, or if you are a business of a certain size, and some, such the EU taxonomy, will be required if you sit in a certain industry. Companies within financial industries are almost certainly likely to be required to report and disclose information, because those are the areas that are at the forefront. The financial industry has certainly been at the forefront of setting up frameworks, setting up policies which require reporting. And it has always been a heavily regulated industry, so this will come as no surprise to anyone. So you may also find that some companies enter into voluntary frameworks, which continue on that. They're usually, again, financial. And most of the ESG regulation and legislation is about disclosure, usually about disclosure of your emissions, and that links in with the net zero requirements of the UK, or it may be around the financial instruments or financial activities of your organization. So many of you may be thinking, well, actually, that doesn't apply to me because I don't meet the size to be required to report, or I'm not in that industry. But what you need to be aware of is that even if you're not directly impacted or affected by these regulations or legislation, you may sit in a supply chain or value chain of somebody who does, or you may have a financial instrument or be working with a lender who does require you to report, and it will often be reporting on your emissions data. So even though it may not affect you directly, just be mindful that you may have reporting requirements that you will be asked to do by somebody else in your supply chain or as a lender. And the second point on my slide is about litigation. So we have seen a huge increase in ESG litigation, particularly climate-related litigation. So I'll talk a bit more about this later under recent trends we're seeing in ESG. But to give you a flavour of how much this has increased, currently there have been about 2,000 climate-related litigation cases filed, and that's doubled. The number of cases have doubled since 2015, and a quarter of those cases have been between 2020 and 2022. So it's a growing trend, and we're seeing companies be not only governments, which has been kind of a theme up to now, governments such as the UK government, Australian government, French government, Dutch government, being held to account for their climate-related plans and their net zero ambitions, and whether they're stretching enough, whether they're on course to meet them. But we're now seeing more and more companies being held to account, more and more directors being held to account on their role in making sufficiently robust and stretching climate change targets, and other areas as well in ESG, such as diversity and inclusion. So we're definitely seeing that as a trend, and it's becoming something that companies are becoming more aware of and being pushed more to think in that direction. And there's also a trend towards shareholder activism in that area, which I'll talk to later. Could I have the next slide, please? So one of the real risks for companies and also opportunities is around finance and getting your ESG right or wrong. So if you attended our session 18 months ago, I think it was now, you will have seen this slide, and it's about a conduct cost project that was carried out in London. And they looked at 20 banks over a data collection period, and those banks had fines, judgments, settlements, disgorgement of profits, etc., in excess of 377 billion. So 377 billion, the period for those fines was only a 10-year period. So that means because of failure to get their ESG right, those banks were spending on average about 1.9 billion a year because they just weren't getting it right. So it's a very stark example, but it's a good reminder of the fact that ESG can really impact you financially by getting it wrong. And it could be anything like the examples we've got on here, that you've got it's fined, it's lost a profit, but it can also hit your share value. A good recent example of this is the Deliveroo IPO. So Deliveroo, the food delivery company, wanted to do an initial public offering on the London Stock Exchange in the last few years. They were targeting a value of 8 billion for their shares. In the period running up to the IPO, shareholder activism meant that shareholders and other activist groups were publicly talking about Deliveroo's business model, which was very much to use the gig economy, so 0-hour contracts, etc. And as a result of this, various investors who would have been thought to have invested in this publicly came out and said that we have ESG concerns, and it's really striking, they actually quoted ESG in this, and therefore we will not be investing. And the end of the IPO, Deliveroo came in at about 5 billion, still a huge amount of money, but when you're targeting 8 billion, it shows that it can be a huge impact on your share value by not getting your ESG right. And another recent example, which most of you will be aware of, is P&O Ferries, when they fired a number of their staff without following the due consultation process. They saw people cancelling holidays, they saw their share value fall. by not getting their ESG right, it had a real financial impact on them. And can we go to the next slide, please? And so reputation is another major issue for ESG, and those cases of Deliveroo and P&O, and I think Neil's going to mention a bit more about P&O and some of the advertising he's seen, which shows how reputationally damaging it can be, or why you want to do something about your reputation, post those things. But it can have a massive impact on your reputation. And it's never been easier to understand what a company's doing, to look into its record, to find out what it's doing, and also to create reputational damage due to social media. And once your reputation is damaged, it can be really, really hard to recover from that. So even though certain companies have made great strides, there may always be a link between when they didn't get their ESG right to now. So, for example, Volkswagen, many people for years just thought of Volkswagen as reliable cars. Some people now will think Volkswagen Dieselgate. BP had Deepwater Horizon, where they had the explosion of the oil rig. Some people will always think of BP in connection with that. And Barclays have openly said that because of being involved with the South African government during apartheid, they lost a whole generation of customers. So there can be long-lasting effects of failure to get your ESG right. And we used to say, today's news, tomorrow's chip paper. It's not like that anymore. But getting your ESG right, on the flip side, can be really positive for your reputation. And there's some increasingly interesting statistics coming out to say how much that companies who get their ESG right or are ESG focused are attractive and desirable to consumers. And I think it was KPMG who did a study that said a third of 18 to 24-year-olds said they would leave a company or wouldn't take a job with it because it had a poor ESG record. So getting your ESG right is going to help your reputation. You're going to avoid those reputational issues that you could run into. And you also make yourself more appealing, more desirable, more likely that people will want to work with you. So could we have the next slide, please? So I'm now going to pass back to Neil to talk a little bit more about some of the governance issues.
Okay, thanks, Carla. Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so we'll canter through this a bit to get towards the trends, I think. But as I mentioned earlier, for governance is key in any organisation to actually making sure the E and the S happen. Unless ESG is embedded in the processes and within the governance structure of your business, it's going to be difficult to make serious change. So we look at, and this is an issue I face in our business in terms of my own role, how we embed ESG into decision-making and budgetary processes. If you get there, it will happen. So we look at our board and committee structure. Do you have somebody who's responsible for ESG at board level? If not, do you have a committee that reports to the board solely on ESG issues? Who has ultimate responsibility? Unless and until someone in an organisation is ultimately responsible for ESG, it's difficult to make serious change within the business. And once you do, it means everybody in your organisation knows who to go to if they want to raise an issue around ESG. And in your governance structure, is this a risk management issue for you? Is it a compliance issue? Or are you looking to do something more ambitious? We've heard about how it can enhance your ability to recruit, attract investment, enhance your brand if you get it right. So where are you on the scale of just risk management versus real ambition? And your policies, obviously, everyone will have them, but are they living documents? Do people know them, and understand why they're needed? So we talked about reputational risk and how getting it wrong can be career limiting if it's your responsibility. But next slide, please, James. And funding also, Carla's highlighted the issues around what can happen to your share price if you're hit with bad publicity around any ESG issue. We're now seeing ESG credentials and compliance as a key part in any fundraising, whether it's an issue of shares or whether it's raining bank finance. We act for banks who are now factoring this in. They factor it into risk. Will I lend to you at all? And if they do, at what rate? And ESG can and will play a key part in whether a bank looks at your business as financially sustainable in the long term. And we've also heard anecdotally stories from our banking clients around the fact that they're talking to customers and say, well, in today's kind of atmosphere around ESG, companies may be backable, but think about your next refinancing. The one thing we know about ESG is the pace of change is huge. What may be a benchmark today may be well below benchmark in 3 to 5 years' time in terms of ESG standards. So measuring and reporting what you do is key, because your backers, financiers, investors will want to do it. ESG audits are a great way of showing the world exactly what you're doing and how good you are in terms of ESG. And again, banks and lenders really like those, because it is an external assessment of just where you've got to. And at the moment, we have, in terms of ESG ratings, we have a real scrutiny from government because of the wide variety of criteria that people apply to ESG. What is good, what is not. There is no standard. And there's been a huge recognition that the issues around greenwashing, social washing, whatever kind of washing you choose to call it, is an issue for ESG. It will lose credibility if we don't improve. So there's a consultation from government going on a new set of regulations coming in around the terminology that people can use and how they will have to justify using terminology that make it appear that a company is ESG compliant, shall we say. Next slide, please, James.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the trends. So Neil and I are going to split these between us. So I'll talk a bit about the environmental, and Neil will take the social and governance trends, because as in-house counsel, you'll be looking at what things does your company need to be aware of. And we've already touched on climate litigation. That is not going anywhere. More companies are also being taken to court, or actions being filed against them for greenwashing around their climate credentials. So it's really critical, when your company is creating any marketing material, is talking about its record, you have enough evidence to back up any claims you make. Greenwashing means making claims about your sustainability that you cannot substantiate. So just make sure that if you are saying anything, don't say we're the most environmentally friendly company in the world if you can't back it up, basically. We're also seeing an increase in shareholder activism. So more and more shareholders are holding boards to account. We've seen that sometimes shareholders have been, members of boards, have been removed due to shareholder activism and replaced with shareholder activist groups. There's also been an increase in shareholder activism with things like Deliveroo, and we're seeing greater groups of litigation funders come through as well. So between climate litigation and shareholder activism, those trends are not going to go anywhere fast. So we just all need to be mindful that that is something that we're seeing more and more of. Another trend and another change to be aware of, especially as lawyers, is new Law Society guidance around climate change. So in April this year, the Law Society published some guidance around our responsibilities as solicitors in relation to climate change and advising our clients, making sure we can advise them appropriately, making sure we understand the risks, both for our businesses and for our clients. And it also included some very specific guidance to in-house counsel. And I'm just going to pass over to Neil just to talk that through briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. Yeah, the guidance is wide-ranging. Remember, this is only guidance at the moment. But as we all know, a lot of regulation starts life as guidance and ends up as something we all have to do. But for in-house counsel and general counsels, there is a section in there that you ought to have a look at, section 4.6, if you're reading them. But it talks about the particular issues faced by in-house counsel. And I think for me, there are a couple of issues just to tease out. One is, first of all, when you're instructing external counsel, have a think about whether their brief should or will include advice on climate-related risk. Are your lawyers going to factor that in, or have they excluded it from their scope? So whoever you're engaging, have a think about that one. And the other issue is that the guidance talks very clearly about the need for in-house lawyers basically to skill up in the whole world of ESG, for want of a better word. There's a recognition that the role will now involve making sure that your board are aware and factor in climate-related risks into the activities of the business itself, and that responsibility will fall on GCs and in-house counsel. So worth a read.
Thanks, Neil. Now, you may have noticed on this slide that I haven't put anything about net zero, and it's not because that's not a really pressing trend and issue. It's because most of us are very acutely aware now of net zero. As Neil said, most of you will have net zero plans in place. And on the back of the COPs, the COP21 in Paris and then COP26 in Glasgow, there has been more and more publicity, scrutiny, etc. And it's becoming part of our of our general day-to-day vocabulary. It's entered the vernacular, turn on the radio, and you'll hear about net zero. So it's becoming something that's really embedded into what we think about, how we act. But the next issue that is coming through, and we're seeing more and more, is around biodiversity. And so that had its own conference of the parties, and recently COP15, and the end of it, they had the Montreal Protocol about how we make sure biodiversity is something that governments are considering. There's more and more press on those pressing issues around biodiversity and the importance of it in society, the importance of it to do with well-being, etc. And as we have the task force on climate-related disclosures having been put into financial disclosure for certain companies, there is also a task force for nature-related disclosures. So biodiversity is something that you're going to see increasing interest and focus on in years to come. So James, could you turn to the next slide, please? And I'm going to pass back to Neil to talk to you about the social and governance trends we're seeing coming through.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. A couple of ones to pick up that we're seeing a lot more noise about. The first is around supply chains. As Carla mentioned, we're getting increasing emphasis on disclosure requirements, and businesses that have to disclose are looking at their supply chains, because that's where a lot of issues may arise in terms of both social and in terms of carbon emissions. So having ESG compliant suppliers is again no longer a nice to have. It's a must have for many organisations. So scrutiny of supply chain is becoming key. Now, obviously, that starts with the terms and conditions that you might impose in the supply chain, but it goes far wider than that. It's the selection process. It's the weighting that you give to ESG factors in the selection of your suppliers. And it's then the monitoring of the suppliers. So that's it's been an issue, obviously, for a long time, but the volume has really been dialed up on the importance of getting it right in your supply chain. And then increased regulation. I'll just quote as an example for those of you who may have customers based in Germany. Well, large German companies are now subject to some new legislation, which actually imposes on them a requirement to understand all of the ESG issues in their supply and value chains. Now, that at the moment affects German companies with more than 3,000 employees. From next year, it will be down to 1,000. Now, that's important. If your business has business in Germany, you need to be aware of that, because you're probably going to face, again, increased questioning about you as a supplier. But also, Germany is the kind of country that a lot of other countries look to as a beacon in terms of which direction they may travel. So expect more kind of legislation like that going forward. Again, supply chains really key. And then governance, legislation and regulation, hot off the press this Monday. The International Financial Reporting Standards Board actually finally published their new global and sustainability and climate disclosure standards. Now, it's been rumbling around since late 21, I think, but there's a couple of key important issues here. One is that this does mark a big step towards integrating sustainability reporting with broader into financial reporting. So it's a key change when it comes into force, which it will do effectively in 2024 and 25. But it also, coming back to a point I mentioned earlier, brings us closer to the point where there is more harmony as to the standards that need to be met by businesses. So there are two key standards in there. There's a lot of reading if you're interested in that kind of stuff, but I think that's a big step forward. Directors' duties, we mentioned in the trailer for this, the Shell case. The Shell case is important, not so much because it focuses on oil, and obviously that's an issue that gets a lot of press at the moment, but about the tactics that were used by the organisations that were trying to drive change in the company. Because they used Section 172 of the Companies Act. They brought a so-called derivative action personally against the directors, alleging breach of directors' duties. Directors' duties is something that's been enshrined in companies' legislation for a long time. So this tactic was around saying that basically the directors have not factored climate risk into their business plan, and that damaged shareholder value. The argument was nothing to do with the environment. Now, Shell won. The judge wasn't that impressed with the arguments and also suggested that the people bringing the claim had a much ulterior motive to shareholder benefit. So I was somewhat skeptical, but nevertheless, you can see that that is a tactic that will be used, because if you look at Section 172 of the Companies Act, it talks about imposing on directors the obligation to consider the impact of their company's operations on the community as well as the environment. And it talks about the desirability of the company maintaining a reputation for high standards of business. And we talked earlier about reputational issues. Well, that's not great for share price. You may lose customers as a result. But the Companies Act also suggests it's one of the factors that directors should be taking into account. So personally, I can see that whilst that case was lost, it is a tactic that might be used by activists across all sorts of issues against all sorts of businesses going forward. So directors' duties, that's one to watch, definitely. Greenwashing, there is effectively a huge emphasis. We're seeing regulators in the US, the EU, the UK, all looking at this as a big issue, and they're attacking the way in which funds describe themselves, the way in which funds rating agencies will operate, as well as companies themselves. And we're seeing litigation in other countries for breach of financial disclosure rules, in other words, misstatements. And we're also seeing actions against companies in the UK. We've seen a couple of cases where the Advertising Standards Agency pulled adverts because they said the adverts were misleading. So greenwashing for businesses and for you in your roles in terms of protecting the companies from risk of greenwashing is a growing key trend. Executive remuneration I've mentioned here because we're seeing it more and more. My own background for many years has been designing incentive schemes. And if a few years ago you'd said to me that we would now see as commonplace performance standards in bonus schemes, stock option plans, and so on, which are related to ESG, I would have been very skeptical. Now it's becoming the norm because what gets rewarded gets done in an organization. And so we're seeing a big trend towards more ESG related KPIs in remuneration structures. And finally, I mentioned learning from experience. As ESG matures, we're now seeing companies that 1 or 2 years ago may have been pilloried for what they were doing, but actually learning from their mistakes and really improving. If take Boohoo as an example, there was a great deal of press commentary around their supply chain and their business practices. What you see now is a massive shift in the way in which they operate. I was at a workshop the other week in which they were hailed as a great example of how good businesses can get if they learn from their mistakes. So we're now seeing businesses actually improve as a result of getting stuff wrong in the first place, which is really heartening. Next slide.
Rather than just being cancelled, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. The key emphasis was that the activism created a really positive result.
Our next slide is actually questions. So,
okay.
Let me just, there's only 2 comments, well, 1 comment, 1 question really, and just say thank you very much to both of you. For you, Carla, you talked about the P&O, just to clarify that we were talking about P&O ferries, not cruise liners.
Yeah, that's correct. But I think there's a good point here, is that your average person doesn't know the difference between those two. I'm just seeing P&O and I booked a cruise with them. I'm cancelling my cruise because I think they've done something wrong, even if it's not P&O. So your damage limitation, they may have done good damage limitation. This is what Neil and I discussed and we didn't get time to mention, but the advertising that they did on the back of that was they were not the same company, were very different. But does an average person make that distinction between P&O ferries and P&O cruises? No, they don't. So it's very easy to do something which is more damaging, not just to one entity, but to more, because all the customer sees is P&O and they don't make that distinction. So it's a really good point to make, and I think it's one worth raising, that actually you might yourself be doing good ESG stuff, but somebody in your company with a similar name might not, and it's going to impact you as well. So it's why it's critical to make sure that the DNA of your company is ESG focused, and also to do that damage limitation, learn from experience. Talk to lawyers, talk to how can you make sure you salvage your reputation, and things like advertising, make sure you get it right, don't greenwash, because it's not only going to impact you, it could potentially impact other companies within your group.
Okay, just briefly while Neil fiddles with his video. The EU has implemented the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will obviously be phased in over a few years. Does the UK have an equivalent? Brief answer, please.
Mhm.
Does it have an equivalent? Yes, it does. Okay, good. That was a very brief answer. Thank you very much. Just to say, our next webinar will be on the 19th of July, but to say thank you again, Carla and Neil, for a fascinating webinar on ESG. I did say at the end, please do give us some feedback, tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, and constructive comments and topics for future webinars. And with that, I'll say thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.